Hey guys, it's Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. In this episode, what we're going to do is actually dive back in to discuss some of the key themes that were discussed in the debate between myself and Chris White. Probably the most significant number of emails that I've received since the debate have basically said, they go, Joel, we agree with you. The Bible doesn't teach that the Antichrist is going to be a false Jewish Messiah who's going to enter Jerusalem peacefully. Like, that whole scenario just doesn't make sense. I don't know where Chris gets that type of thing. However, because of the format of the debate, you guys both felt rushed because it was your opportunity to respond was shorter and shorter as the debate went forward, and because there were more and more topics being discussed. They said, we just really don't feel as though either of you are able to do justice to the discussion. So could you dial in on some of these key themes and really lay them out? So there's still some confusion concerning some issues. Okay, so I think that's good, as I said in the last episode, just to take some time and to lay out what the scriptures teach. Now, again, let me reiterate the exhortation that I began the debate with, which is to say this, and this is really important just in a general sense. I think for all students of Bible prophecy to recognize this basic fact. We all, as students of prophecy who are interested in eschatology, we all have what I will call a prophetic imagination. And what I mean by that is we have a certain way that we picture it. We go, well, based on, and it's usually based on what I see out in the world right now and what I've personally experienced. Some of it has to do with our own personal experiences, and what I see in the scriptures. I picture the end times to be this way. And the sad thing about this, I think if a lot of us are honest, and I'm often analyzing people's arguments, oftentimes this prophetic imagination, this scenario whereby people imagine how it's going to be, the scriptures are actually last in terms of the issues that form their prophetic scenario. And so it's so important, and this is really what I wanted to emphasize throughout the debate, is that ultimately how I picture it, how I imagine it, how I can imagine. I can imagine it to be this way, or I can imagine it to be that way. None of that matters. The only thing that matters is what the scriptures state, and we have to really conform and bend our scenarios, our imaginative scenarios, to what the scriptures state. And so for what it's worth, my tech guy went back and worked through the actual debate. I actually read 52 verses. I put up 52 verses and read part or all of them throughout the debate. Chris put up, I don't know how many, but they were so fast and he wouldn't read them. He would just say, well, the Bible says this, the Bible says that. And so much of his arguments revolved around, well, this says that and this says that, and therefore I can picture it working out this way. A lot of it is just really raw speculation, and this is so important in terms of the debate really wasn't between me and Chris White. In my opinion, the debate was between Chris White and the scriptures. What do the scriptures say? He was trying to prove that his scenario that doesn't really fit with the biblical template is in fact scriptural. And so it was comforting, for what it's worth, after the debate to see the Reverend Charles Cooper, who's actually was Chris's professor, a very seasoned statesman within the pre-wrath camp, to come out and say, I don't see it at all. What Chris was laying out, I don't see the Antichrist being a false Jewish Messiah, and to see him agree with what I was presenting, which is that the scriptures are very clear that the Antichrist comes in a hostile, adversarial manner against Israel, against Jerusalem, and really against God himself. So let's jump in. And again, some of this is going to be review, because I did touch on these issues during the debate. But again, let's just, for clarity, begin by framing out Chris's perspective, again, his scenario in terms of how he pictures it. So Chris said, when the Antichrist surrounds Jerusalem with these armies, okay, this is what we're going to focus in on today, is the invasion of Jerusalem, or the entrance into Jerusalem by the Antichrist and his armies. So Chris says, when the Antichrist surrounds Jerusalem with these armies, there's no indication that he's hostile toward Jerusalem. And so this is so important. He actually teaches that he comes into Jerusalem as a welcomed, received, celebrated liberator, that he is received as the Jewish king. He doesn't come in as a hostile invader. And so that's so important. Again, I pointed out that all of the shadows and the types of the Antichrist down through history have always been hostile Gentile invaders, whether it be Sennacherib with the Assyrians, whether it be Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians, whether it be Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler, whether it be the Romans. It's always been Gentile invaders, hostile, destructive Gentile invaders. And these are the primary biblical types of the Antichrist, okay? But he says there's no indication. And this is important. He doesn't say, well, the passages that people classically point to are questionable. He's very dogmatic. There is no indication whatsoever. He also says the Antichrist will probably enter through whatever gate the Messiah is supposed to enter, probably riding a donkey. In other words, imitating Jesus. He says he's going to enter Jerusalem at this time as the king. He sits in the temple, not as a person defiling the temple from the Jews' perspective. It's not an abomination from their perspective. So he actually says that the Antichrist will have good theology. It will appear as though he has really good biblical theology, if he were not a false Messiah. If he were actually the true Messiah, he will be quoting Bible verses and quoting them correctly. And he will be received as such. And this is, according to Chris, the great deception, is that the Antichrist will have good theology. He won't be hostile. He'll be championing the Bible. He'll be championing Judaism. In fact, his religion will be Judaism. He'll be enforcing Judaism onto the world. Okay? Another quote from Chris. He says, basically anybody that should have fled Jerusalem. Now, he's talking about the midpoint of the final 7 years. He said they probably should have fled Jerusalem at that time. In other words, immediately after the midpoint of the final 7 years, when the abomination that causes desolation takes place, when the Antichrist enters the temple. He said anybody that should have fled by that time. So for the next 3.5 years, please hear this, it's going to be this false facade of utopia. So for Chris, after the midpoint, it's going to appear as though everything is wonderful, okay? Just like in the Legos movie. Everything is awesome. It's going to be this false facade of utopia, or at least up until the rapture. So for Chris, from the midpoint up until the rapture, wherever that is, again, the pre-wrath perspective, it's undetermined. It's sometime during the final 3.5 years when the wrath of God begins to be poured out. So here is just a picture of the chart that he created. And notice that he has not only the first half of the final 3.5 years, but extending past the midpoint right up until the day of the Lord, right up until the rapture. He says Antichrist will have on this mask that says, I'm a good guy, and there will be no hostility. He says, again, very dogmatically, very emphatically, none whatsoever. So now let's go back and look at the verses that I read, which he disregarded, really just with a wave of his hand. He said, no, those are all applied to the day of the Lord, and they don't count. Okay, let's look at them, and what I want to do is zero in on some of the key themes, some of the key phrases, some of the key motifs, and language that all of these passages share, numerous commonalities, and then discuss where they fit within the timeline. Are they all reserved just to be right up there tucked around the time period of Armageddon just before the final return of Jesus, or do they apply to this entire 3.5 year period? And as we'll see, they clearly apply to the entire 3.5 year period, which unfortunately completely undermines Chris's entire theory of this Antichrist that will be celebrated, that will be welcomed, that will stroll into Jerusalem unopposed, received by the Jews, celebrated by the Jews, championed by the Jews, and worshiped by the Jews. Okay? So the key motifs, the key themes that we're going to see really throughout all of these texts are the following. Okay, first of all, Jerusalem will, not just Jerusalem, but Judah, will be besieged. It will be invaded. Okay, the scriptures specifically use these terms. These are not positive terms. The Antichrist and his armies will besiege and invade and attack Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, so Israel, not just Jerusalem, but Israel itself. And these armies of the Antichrist are consistently and repeatedly referred to as Gentile armies. They are the armies of the nations. They are the armies of the Goyim Saviv. This is the surrounding nations, the surrounding Gentiles, or alternately the Am Saviv, the peoples round about. They are Israel's neighbors, Israel's hostile neighbors today, and increasingly hostile as we approach the return of Jesus. These verses speak of plunder, looting, raping, and killing, okay? None of which is positive, none of which is something that someone with perfect doctrine would do. The overwhelming emphasis is on hostile, invading armies, destroying, plundering, looting, and raping, okay? No matter how you try to twist it, you can't say that a false Jewish Messiah that appears to have great doctrine is somehow going to justify raping the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Okay, you could say, well, he's going to kill the rebels, or this type of thing. He's going to exterminate those that don't submit. But how can you justify him raping the women and stealing stuff? Okay, so we're going to look at that. Number 4, they repeatedly emphasize exile, captivity, and Israel being taken away to the surrounding Gentile nations as prisoners of war. Number 5, it also talks about dividing the land, so occupying the land of Israel, dividing it up. And 6, desecration and desolation, again, which Chris interprets as something that will be viewed as desecration and desolation from God's perspective. But as he said, from the Jews' perspective, it will appear to be a good thing. And he even argues, if you really do follow all of his, again, when he lays out his scenarios, he said that many of the Christians of the world will be suckered into this because they'll say, oh, wow, this is the Messiah. This guy's doing everything that we expected him to do. And so when they see him sit in the temple, it will be a great deception. So let's begin with Joel 3, 1 through 2, and this is the passage that I started with in the debate. So again, Joel, the context of the prophet Joel. Joel is all the way back there around the time of Isaiah. He was speaking of this locust plague, this invasion of locusts in the land of Israel that were devouring everything. That was a type of what? The coming Babylonians. Now, this is the nature of types, by the way. Types and shadows reflect the thing that they are pointing to. Now, obviously, people and locusts have some dramatic differences, but they are both invaders, they are both devourers, they are both hostile, okay? And so the locusts are pointing to the Babylonian Gentile invaders. Now, guys, please hear this. The Babylonian Gentile invaders are types and foreshadows of the armies of the Antichrist. Okay, the pattern is very clear. You can't say the locusts represent the Babylonians who represent the armies of the Antichrist that will come in peacefully and will be celebrated. That just doesn't make sense. But that is the backdrop for Joel. So in Joel chapter 3, Joel says, at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. So that's today. The Lord has restored the fortunes of Israel. They are back in the land. They've been gathered from all over the nations. The Lord has restored the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. He says, at that time I will gather all the Gentiles, all the nations, and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Again, that's Jerusalem. Then I will enter into judgment with them on behalf of my people, my inheritance Israel. Now, this is very important because, again, the scriptures speak of God's people Israel. In their unbelief, God still calls them my people. This is so important. Throughout the book of Romans, throughout particularly Romans 9 through 11, Paul uses the language of Israel, even as they are enemies of the gospel, as beloved, as God's holy people. And so there's kind of a paradox here where they're not saved yet, but in the sovereignty of God, he knows those that are his, that they will be saved. And because of his commitments, because of his covenant promises to his people, he refers to them as my people. They're mine. They're my inheritance. And because the Gentiles have mistreated them, he says, I'm going to enter into judgment against the Gentiles. And so what have the Gentiles done? They've scattered my people among the nations. They've divided my land. So Joel here speaks of the exile, the imprisonment of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah. It's very simple. Now, Chris said this just speaks of the day of the Lord. So he moves it up to Armageddon, to the very end of the final 7-year period, and he says this has no relevance to the period between the midpoint of the final 7 years and the rapture. He says this does not apply. He moves it right up until Armageddon. The problem with that is that the motifs and the themes and the phrases that Joel is using are identical to other passages which are absolutely, undeniably, which Chris would acknowledge, speaking of this period immediately after the midpoint of the final 7 years. So we'll take note of the fact that here Joel is speaking of the Gentiles, okay, so the Gentile hostile armies taking away the Jews as prisoners of war. Okay, so you've got probably 3 or 4 of the themes just right here in Joel 3, 1 and 2. Skipping forward a bit, verses 12 through 14. Let the Gentiles, let the nations, the Goyim, be aroused and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge the surrounding Gentiles. There it is, Goyim Saviv, the peoples round about, the neighbors. It's basically what it means, is the neighbors. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come tread, the winepress is full, the vats overflow. Their wickedness is great, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Now, I want to be very clear. I agree with Chris that the context of this is the day of the Lord. However, this is where we need to be so careful not to make the mistake of interpreting the Bible like a typical Westerner, which is to say, this passage is speaking of the day of the Lord and Armageddon, but it has no relevance to the period after the 3.5 years, as if it's really just within this tight little window. And just within this tight little window, they'll have the time to invade the land, to divide the land, to lead all of these people away captive, that all only happens right up at the very tail end of the final 7 years. Well, there's a lot of stuff that has to unfold for this to all take place. But let me just give you an example of what I mean by misinterpreting texts and by tucking them into a very narrow time frame. There's so many passages that I could use as examples, but let's just say Isaiah 25. Isaiah 25 is ultimately speaking about the marriage supper of the Lamb in Jerusalem, and it's talking about the millennium. Okay, now, again, premillennialists will all look to Isaiah 25 as this time the Lord's going to throw this great feast with aged wine and choice pieces of meat and marrow, one of my favorite passages. It's ultimately the marriage supper of the Lamb. On this mountain I will throw a choice feast. That's Jerusalem. But as you skip forward, well, you have this sort of famous verse that is often quoted. Of course, it's quoted in Revelation, but it's often quoted in funerals. I will wipe away all tears, and death will be no more. Well, you go, wait a minute, during the millennium, there's still death. So is this the millennium or is this the eternal state? And this is just a classic example, and you see this throughout ancient Near Eastern, particularly Hebrew prophetic poetry, where it essentially is just looking forward to the future. And it essentially, for all intents and purposes, it mixes the millennium with the eternal state. And it just goes like, in that day. And it speaks of it in a very general sense, but it's clearly using language for the millennium, but it's also using language clearly that speaks of the eternal state. That doesn't apply to the millennium. And so this is just an example where if we, again, Westerners, we want to dissect the Word of God like it's this technical manual. Verse 2 to 4 is Armageddon, but verses 5 through 6 is before the day of the Lord. And we get really technical, and I would argue way overly technical, and we restrict numerous passages within the Word of God, way more than the Bible itself restricts them. Oftentimes, it just speaks in very general sense. Look at another example, Daniel 12. It says, at that time there will be a great tribulation such as has never been since there was a nation up until that time. Now, we all know, and again, Chris will agree, that that is speaking of the period immediately following the midpoint, the abomination of desolation, the middle of the final 7 years. But then it says, At that time, many of your people who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake and arise to everlasting life, others to everlasting destruction. So in one verse, it's talking about the midpoint, the abomination that causes desolation, the great tribulation that will take place at that point. It talks about the resurrection of the righteous and the resurrection of the wicked. The resurrection of the wicked doesn't actually take place until the end of the millennium. And so there's another verse where it just consolidates the future into one tight little passage, but it's actually speaking of a broad period of time. Isaiah 9, unto us a child is born, a son is given. Okay, is it talking about the birth of Christ? The government will rest on his shoulders. Or is it talking about the millennium? All of the above. In one narrow little passage, you have well over 3,000 years of material all compressed into one little poetic passage. And so this is what I mean by it's a false claim to say, well, this only has to do with Armageddon, and deny the clear connections within this passage to other passages which are clearly connected to the midpoint, and say they have nothing to do with one another because this is exclusively the day of the Lord and not referring to the period immediately after the midpoint. The Bible, for all intents and purposes, it uses the day of the Lord in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's a very narrow day of the Lord. It's the day that Jesus actually returns. Sometimes it's the whole window from the time of the resurrection until really the end of the destruction of his enemies and the pouring out of his wrath. And other times it's actually dealing with the whole period of the final 3.5 years. In the more restricted technical sense, yes, it's that limited narrow window, but there are times that it's used in a broader sense. And this is the type of thing that theologians argue and haggle and wrestle over endlessly. But it's easy to demonstrate that at times it is used a bit more broadly. And there are passages, the context of which is, yes, the day of the Lord, absolutely 100%. But to say that they must be restricted to this narrow little sliver of time just before the return of Jesus, it doesn't work. And it doesn't allow for all of the events that have to take place, the tremendous detailed events, the complex events that have to take place within these passages. It just doesn't allow enough time for them. Rather, these are events that unfold throughout the final 3.5 years before the end of the 7 years. Okay, Zechariah 12, 2 through 3. I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to, here it is, the Am Saviv, the peoples around Israel. When the siege, is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. So here is a hostile siege. Okay, very clear. What Zechariah is talking about is an invasion, a siege of Jerusalem and Judah. It will come about in that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will be ruptured. Again, the language there, as I pointed out, people were laughing. It is the imagery of a hernia, which before the time of surgery, it was a slow, painful death sentence. And I can testify as someone who's had a couple hernia surgeries, if you don't address them, it just gets worse and worse. And in ancient times, that would eventually kill someone. Everyone who tries to mess with Jerusalem, it's a death sentence. They're going to break themselves, is the language. And all the nations, all the Gentiles of the earth will be gathered against it. Okay, so again, clearly the language of siege. The nations are gathered against Jerusalem. Now, this is when you really zero in, again, on Chris's prophetic scenario, you go, how does this work? Because these are the nations that Chris says the Antichrist conquered. They were all worshiping him. These are the beast nations. How is it that they are now attacking Jerusalem and Judah, and specifically hostile against the Jewish people, specifically taking the Jewish people away as captives? Because what Chris would say is that they are turning on the harlot. They're invading not to attack the Jews, but to attack the Antichrist, to take the city and the land back from the Antichrist. Like it's a very convoluted scenario to try to understand. They are clearly invading Israel and Jerusalem. Zechariah 12, 9 through 8. In that day I will set about to destroy, to judge, the Lord said, all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Again, The Gentiles are hostile. The Lord will destroy them. I will pour out on the house of David, on the other hand, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Jews, okay? There is the Israelis. He goes, on them, he's not going to destroy them, right? Because within Chris's scenario, the Lord judges the Jews that are remaining in Jerusalem right up until the end, because he said all the other ones should have fled by then, right? These are the guys, according to Chris, that are worshiping the Antichrist. Yet in this scenario, the inhabitants, notice that these are not those that are out in the desert. The inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah, the Lord pours out his Spirit on them. He saves them. Wait a minute, I thought these guys are the ones that are cut off. I thought these are the ones that are supporting the Antichrist. Those that are remaining in Jerusalem and Judah right up until the end, the day of the Lord saves them. He pours out his Spirit. Yes, he'll pour out his Spirit on those that have fled out in the desert, but he'll also pour out his Spirit on those that remain in Jerusalem, whether they are occupied, whether they're prisoners, however it works. It's the inhabitants of Jerusalem that are saved. That's so important. So they will look on me whom they have pierced. And then, again, we're going to skip over Zechariah 13. That's where it talks about 2/3 of the inhabitants of the land being killed. Who are they killed by? The hostile Gentile invaders. Those are the ones that Chris tried to say are actually, many of them, worshiping the Antichrist. And I brought that up. He never came back and addressed it. It's a glaring contradiction within his whole scenario. But Zechariah 14, 1 through 4, behold, the day is coming for the Lord. Okay, the day, what day? The day of the Lord. Now notice the motifs here, notice the language. The spoil will be taken from you and divided amongst you. So clearly the Gentiles are hostile. They're taking spoil and plunder. For I will gather the nations, the Gentiles, against Jerusalem to battle. Obviously hostile. The city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished. Who are being ravished? The Jews. Half of the city will go into exile. Now, how long does it take for that to happen, for half of the city to be taken as prisoners of war? Does that all happen right around Armageddon, just like within a couple week period? No, this is something that unfolds over a 3.5-year period. Again, the prophecy is broad. Yes, it may zero in and focus on the day of the Lord, but its ultimate parameters, they're much more broad than just this narrow little window of Armageddon, which we will continue to see. Then, again, after the city's been ransacked, the women have been ravished, half of the city of Jerusalem become prisoners of war. The other half are occupied. Then the Lord will go forth and fight as a man of war against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day, in that time period, he will eventually, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. So he eventually makes his way up to Jerusalem. What does Isaiah say? Isaiah 34, 1 through 2 and verse 8. Draw near, O you nations, draw near, you Gentiles, to hear, and listen, O you peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear. For the Lord's indignation is against the Gentiles. His wrath is against their armies. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for Zion. Zion, Jerusalem, the Jewish people, the people of Israel, it's all the same thing. God's not angry about the stones. He's not angry about the city. He's angry about the people and the way the Gentiles have treated his people. Where are the people? Many of them are still in the city. Many of them are still in the land. They are occupied. They have been conquered. And he comes back to fight for them and redeem them and save them. That's what happens to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is saved. Jerusalem is not destroyed. Okay? Ezekiel 38, 10 through 12. Now again, as I said, all of the prophets are basically telling the same story. And this is what I want everyone to recognize here. They're all telling the same general story. Yes, they're emphasizing different aspects, different facets of the story, but the general story is the same. And within Chris's scenario, it's so chopped up. It's like, well, no, Ezekiel 38 and 39, that's at the end of the millennium. And, you end up with just such a convoluted, really hard to wrap your head around his scenario. It's very simple. They're all telling the same story. So Ezekiel 38, it will come about on that day, the Lord, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil plan. Listen, it takes a long time to plan a multinational invasion of one of the most powerful militaries in the world. This isn't something that just happens overnight. This is a long period of time. Ezekiel, yes, it focuses on the battle when they're destroyed, but it unfolds over a broad period of time. It begins with the very thoughts being planted into the Antichrist Gog's mind, and then it ends with his destruction and the parousia. It ends with the Lord being present in the land of Israel, the Holy One in the land of Israel. Kadosh, Kadosh, Bah Yisrael. It's the only time that that phrase is used in the whole Old Testament. The nations will know that I am the Holy One in Israel. Okay, so he says, thoughts will come into your mind, you'll devise an evil plan, you'll say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I'm going to go up against the modern-day state of Israel. I will go against those who are at rest. They live securely, all of them living without walls, having no bars or gates. To do what? To capture spoil. Ezekiel says the exact same thing that what Zechariah described. When the armies come into Jerusalem, what do? Capture spoil. The spoil will be divided amongst you. He says, I'm going to go capture spoil, seize plunder. Again, Zechariah says, spoil. The houses are plundered, the women are ravished. Ezekiel describes the exact same thing. To turn your hand against what? The waste places which are now inhabited. What has Israel done? They have re-inhabited the former waste places. That's the modern state of Israel. And against the people who are gathered from the nations. Okay, that is the modern state of Israel. Now again, I think I'll do another whole session just on Ezekiel 38 and 39, just to emphasize that this clearly is an event that takes place before the millennium, or right at the end of, it culminates at the very end of the final 7 years. Now what's interesting, by the way, I'll just throw this out, is one of the things that Chris does a handful of times throughout the debate is he tries to say, well, my position is like scholarly consensus. And so he throws up two articles. He says, now his position, that Ezekiel 38 and 39 actually takes place at the very end of the millennium. He cites two guys. He cites J. Paul Tanner, and he cites another guy named Ralph Alexander, who I think he actually wrote the commentary on Ezekiel for the Expositor's Bible Commentary. So he throws up an article written by Ralph Alexander, and he says, like, these guys, for example, support my view. Well, again, this is unfortunately what Chris did throughout the debate, is he just threw up these slides, and then he moved on. He said, well, this says this says that. But it's as though he was relying on the fact that people wouldn't actually look up what he was posting. Now, yes, J. Paul Tanner does argue for a post-millennial Gog-Magog invasion, that Ezekiel 38-39 takes place at the end of the millennium. Again, it has insurmountable problems, but I understand why Paul does that. He ultimately does it, by the way, because he begins with this Roman presupposition. So that's a whole other issue that we could get into. I think we will do that when we talk about Ezekiel. But if you actually look at Ralph Alexander's article and read it through to the very end, Ralph doesn't agree with Chris. Chris goes, well, here are guys that support my view. What Ralph says is that the events that take place at the end of Revelation is simply a recapitulation of the battle that takes place during the tribulation. That's my perspective. That's what I believe. I believe the events that are described in Revelation 20, it's just a recapitulation of Satan and his puppet and his hordes. It just happens one last time. But Ezekiel 38 and 39, its primary fulfillment are the events of the Antichrist. And so it's so funny that he just does that, like, yeah, and it's consensus and all these scholars agree with me. And then you look it up and you go, actually, one of these guys is articulating my exact position, and he disagrees with Chris. So this is why it's important to be a Berean and to check the references and this type of thing. So now I want to just touch on a couple of the reasons. I touched on them in the debate, but why Ezekiel is absolutely talking about the Antichrist, why Gog is the Antichrist. As I showed, Ezekiel 39:23, and this is as a direct result. Now, I want to encourage you to really read Ezekiel 39. Ezekiel, the Lord through Ezekiel, is describing the results of the destruction of Gog and his hordes and his armies. He says, the nations will know that the house of Israel went into exile for their iniquity, because they acted treacherously against me. Now again, when did they go into exile? After they've been invaded. What does Zechariah say? What does Joel say? That when these Gentiles come in, half of the city is going to go into exile. They're going to be led captives among the nations. Zechariah and Joel have already described this. Ezekiel is describing the same thing: captivity, prisoners of war. And the Gentiles, they'll know that the Lord allowed this to happen to Israel one last time because of their sin, their iniquity. But the Lord was chastising them. The Lord was preparing them, breaking them in order that they could turn to him whom they have pierced. Okay, so again, you have the same motifs here in Ezekiel, as in Joel, as in Zechariah. They went into exile for their iniquity. They acted treacherously against me, and I hid my face from them, so I gave them into the hand of their adversaries. This is yet future. This takes place in that final 3.5-year period, and as we'll see, Jesus himself affirms this. He says, and all of them fell by the sword. This is clearly the language of the chastisements, the curses of the covenant. It's laid out in detail in Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 4, Leviticus 26. The Lord said, if you don't obey me, if you don't obey the words of this covenant, here's what's going to happen. He says, you'll fall by the sword and you'll be led captive among the Gentiles. I'll bring the Gentiles. He explains it in detail. And then again, it happened throughout history with the Assyrians, with Babylon, with Rome. It's happened multiple times. Ezekiel 39:29. The Lord says, as a direct result of Gog and his armies being destroyed, he says, I will not hide my face anymore from them when I pour out my spirit upon the house of Israel, declares the Lord. When does the Lord pour out his spirit on Israel? Zechariah already explains. He says, when they look upon the one they have pierced. Now, in the debate, I brought this up. I said, if this is the case, and this takes place at the end of the millennium, then Chris has a glaring problem. Israel doesn't even get saved. They've been living with Jesus as their King Messiah over them for 1,000 years, and he doesn't even pour out his spirit on them until the end of the 1,000 years. And I said, Chris, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, did he address it? Did he ever respond to it? No. He declares at the end of the video, I responded to all of Joel's objections, and I did great. But he skipped over so many of the verses that I brought up. Here's another one that he skipped over. Ezekiel 39, verse 8. Behold, the Lord is speaking of Gog of Magog. Ezekiel 38:39. Behold, it is coming, and it will be brought about, declares the Lord. This is the day that I have spoken of. What is the day that the Lord is speaking of throughout all of the prophets? The day of the Lord. What is Joel talking about? The day of the Lord. What is Zechariah talking about? The day of the Lord. What is Ezekiel talking about? The day of the Lord. There's not another day. And I put out the challenge. I said, Chris, if this is talking about something at the end of the millennium, then show me all these verses where the Lord is speaking of this great battle at the end of the 1,000 years. Where are all the prophets talking about this? It doesn't exist. And I said, I want to issue this challenge. He never even responded. Again, he just declared, I responded to everything that Joel said. And it's like, by the time that you get there, 15 minutes later, you go, yeah, he did. But he never even attempted to touch it. Another one, Ezekiel 38, verse 17. The Lord looks at Gog, again, the Antichrist, and he says, are you not the one that I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is, you're the guy. You're the guy that all of the other prophets have been talking about. And what have they said? They said, at that time they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. So the Lord says to Gog, you're the guy that all the prophets have been talking about, saying that I will bring you against the land of Israel. Now again, think of the pre-Ezekiel prophets, Joel, Isaiah, Micah, right? Who are they talking about? Are they talking about an invader at the end of the millennium? No, they're all talking about the Antichrist. They're talking about the Gentile armies of the Antichrist. And so again, I issued the challenge. I said, Chris, show me the verses. God says all the other prophets are talking about it. Show me where they are. This should be an easy challenge. He ignored it. He ignored the challenge. Micah 5:2, 5, and 6. This is one of the most well-known messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Again, Micah is back there closer to the time period of Isaiah. And he says, but as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, okay, village, Bethlehem and Ephrathah, essentially right next to each other. From you will go forth one for me who will be ruler over Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Okay, it's talking about the Messiah. It's the Bethlehem-born Messiah. This is talking about Jesus. Work through any number of conservative, evangelical, futurist commentators, and they will all acknowledge that this is talking about Jesus, okay? What does it say here that Jesus would do? Verse 5. This one will be our peace when the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples our citadels. Notice the language there, that this individual, whoever he is, will trample our citadels. That's identical language to what Jesus says that the Antichrist will do. And he will deliver us. Who will deliver us? The Bethlehem-born Messiah. He will deliver us from the Assyrian. Well, wait a minute. I don't remember in Jesus' ministry any time where he delivered Israel from the Assyrian. When the Assyrian does what? Verse 6, when he attacks our land and when he tramples our territory. Now, Chris has, again, as he does with so many passages, a really novel, unique, and I would argue even really kind of goofy interpretation of this text. Now, again, we have to admit this is talking about Jesus. He's born in Bethlehem. This was actually the verse that was referred to by the scribes when Herod inquired, where, or is the Sadducees, where is the Messiah going to be born? They said he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Okay, it was obviously referring back here to Micah 5. And it says that the Bethlehem-born Messiah would deliver Israel from the Assyrian. Now, how does Chris get around this? Because if the Assyrian is a title for the Antichrist, or the historical Assyrian is used as a prototype, a shadow of the Antichrist, that doesn't sound like a Jewish Antichrist, does it? So the way Chris gets around this, because he has to, is he takes a very rare and novel interpretation. And he looks to the NET translation, and he says basically what is being said here is that it's just theoretical. Basically what the verse is saying is that, like, during the millennium, during the time of the millennium, if the Assyrians invaded our land, then the Messiah would take care of him. Now, obviously, that's never going to happen, but we're just saying that when this Messiah comes, he's going to be so strong so that if anyone does invade us, it's not going to be a problem. But it's all theoretical. Like, the Bible knows it's never going to happen, but it's just saying if it did. Like, that's really weird. I'm sorry, but that is just a really strange interpretation. It's clearly saying when the Assyrian invades our land, when he marches across our borders, he will be our peace. He will deliver us. And who? Jesus. And so here again, you have the language of an invasion of the surrounding nations, hostile Gentile nations, trampling. Multiple times it uses the language of invasion, trampling, some of the key themes and motifs that all of the other prophets are also using, okay? It's all of the same stuff over and over again. Daniel 11, verses 30 through 32. Now, Chris actually read part of this passage during the debate, but he left out the larger surrounding context. And why is this important? Well, because when you read the surrounding context, it's impossible to understand this, to conform to Chris's perspective. Again, that the Antichrist has perfect theology, that from the Jews' perspective, he'll be saying all the right things. So verse 30 begins. It says, then he will rage against the Holy Covenant. How would the Jews view that as a positive thing? He will be raging against the covenant. And at what point does he do this? Again, as we'll see, this passage makes it clear, at the midpoint, at the middle of the 7-year period, at the 3.5-year mark, he is raging against the covenant. His mask comes off at the 3.5-year mark, not sometime later in the final 3.5 years, but it is specifically, repeatedly, over and over and over again, declared to be at the middle of the final week that his mask comes off. He is raging against the Holy Covenant and taking action. On his return, because he's clashing, there's this clash between Egypt in the south. And on his return from clashing with Egypt, it says he will favor those who abandon the Holy Covenant. So he's allied with those who are opposed to, again, the holy covenant. There can be no question in terms of which covenant we're talking about here. His forces will rise up and desecrate the temple fortress. This is not positive. It's not that his forces will rise up and, from God's perspective, desecrate it, but from the Jews' perspective, all will look wonderful and peachy and utopian. There's simply no way that you can see that here. His forces, he and his forces are opposed to the covenant. Now they are desecrating the temple. Again, they are against God's people, God's covenant, God's temple, God's city. They're against God. The Antichrist and his forces are against all of these things. They will abolish the regular sacrifice and set up the abomination that causes desolation. Listen, this is crystal clear. With flattery, he will corrupt those who act wickedly toward the covenant. There is no way that you can understand that as those who are outwardly seeming to conform to the covenant. They are acting wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will be strong and take action. Now again, as I mentioned, Chris actually cited part of this in the debate, applying it to the Antichrist. We know it's talking about the Antichrist because later in chapter 12, verse 11, Gabriel and the other angels refer back to this that they were just talking about and clearly apply it to the day of the Lord, the time of the resurrection of the dead, and the end of the age. Okay, so there's simply no way that you can understand any of this as appearing to be friendly, as appearing to be a time of utopia. It just simply does not work. And what Chris wants us to believe is, no. These armies that invade Jerusalem, they're totally different. These guys are going to be received as liberators. All of the other passages that talk about invading forces, well, those are negative, but they happen much later. And you go, based on what? Other than just your theory, other than you say it must be because it has to fit your theory, what is there within the text that indicates that these guys are anything other than hostile? Here's Jesus. And again, this is really, to me, I just don't understand. Like, it still boggles my mind how anyone can look at this and interpret it as non-hostile. Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, again, he's using the same language as all of the other prophets, armies, Gentiles invading Jerusalem. What reason would we have to see this as being something completely different than what all the other prophets are talking about? Jesus is expounding upon that which came before him, that which his Old Testament literate listeners and followers were familiar with. He said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, in Matthew 24, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation. So we know that this is at the midpoint. The point that Chris says will kick off this couple-year period of facade of utopia, where there is no hostility, quote, none whatsoever. Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize that her desolation is near. Now notice he doesn't just say the temple. He says the desolation of Jerusalem is upon it. It's not just the temple. The entire thing is about to be desolated. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave. He doesn't just say, if you're my follower, get out. He tells everyone to get out. Why? And it's very clear, by the way, I'm not going to read the whole passage. He says, don't even go back and get your jacket. The primary emphasis of the text is the immediacy, the urgency to get out immediately because something is about to happen immediately. Don't waste a second. Don't go back and get your iPhone. Don't go back up on the roof. Don't even run upstairs and grab your jacket. Get out as quickly as you can. Anyone who reads this acknowledges that is what he said. Those who are in the midst of the city must leave. Those who are in the country, even those who are out in the countryside, must not enter the city because these are the days of vengeance. This is to the land and to the people. For there will be a great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. The land and the people, great wrath. How can you interpret great wrath as a facade of utopia? Those are just simply contradictory. They don't work. Again, if you can demonstrate that Jerusalem will be trampled in a violent, hostile way from the midpoint forward, Chris's entire theory completely collapses. It doesn't work. That's why he has to argue so vehemently that there's no hostility at all, that this is a period of, again, utopia. Great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword. Who else says that? Ezekiel. Who else said the sword? Zechariah. I mean, this is, again, repeated motifs. Jesus is simply drawing from the Bible. It's not like he's just making up new information out of thin air. They will fall by the sword. What else? They will be led captive into the nations. Who else talked about them being led captive to the nations? Joel, Zechariah, Ezekiel. All of them spoke about the same things. So why would we say, well, Jesus is talking about something completely different here? This, you have to understand it through my lens. This is actually going to all be viewed as very positive. But all the other guys, that's different. That takes place at the very end because those are the Gentiles, right? I mean, this is desperate, trying to force square pegs into round holes. Like, just let the text speak for itself. They will be led captive into all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot until the time of the Gentiles, by the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Again, it couldn't be more clear. The invasion of the Gentiles, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, understand that those armies are about to desolate the city. Wrath to the land, wrath to the people, fall by the sword, captive to the nations. Jesus basically draws from Joel, from Zechariah, from Micah, from Ezekiel. He draws from all of them and he consolidates it into one very simple statement. He goes, and where does he put the timing of it? The midpoint. The midpoint, the abomination of desolation. There's just no way that you can come to these passages and see it in a positive light unless you're trying to force a scenario, a theory, a prophetic imaginative idea into the pages of Scripture. But they certainly don't say that on the surface level. They certainly don't. Revelation 11, 1 through 2, and again, this was a passage that Chris brought up. The angel says, there was given to me, to John, a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Now, what Chris was trying to say in the debate is that the worshipers here are after the midpoint. After the midpoint, they're there worshiping. And he says, but leave out the outer court because that's been given to the Gentiles. No. Notice the rest of the passage. For it has been given to the Gentiles, they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. So in the future, right here, the 42 months, the 3.5 years is future. So this takes place before the 3.5 years. He goes, measure the temple, measure those who worship in it, the altar. So they're worshiping in the temple during the first 3.5 years. But he says during the second half of the final 7 years, the Gentiles are going to trample it all down. I mean, it's really crystal clear. It's the final 3.5 years. Chris is trying to say this is already in the 3.5 years. Then why does he say they will tread it down for 42 months in the future? Again, that doesn't make any sense. And yet, again, as I said, he's a very articulate guy. And he says very unbiblical things with a straight face and with a lot of confidence. People go, yeah, that makes sense. And I go, no, it doesn't. Stop and think about it. Be a Berean. Be a Berean and pay attention to what the Scriptures say. So I think that is probably the last verse that we'll look at. There's probably quite a few others that we could look at. But let me just end again by saying this. From Deuteronomy to the prophets to Jesus to the apostles, the book of Revelation, they're all basically telling the same story. And this is what I've said so many times. It's a pretty easy story. Any one of us can understand it. It's really straightforward. They're all repeating the same descriptions. They're using the same themes, the same motifs, the same phrases, the same words. They're all describing the same general story. A coalition, an empire, an alliance of hostile, surrounding Gentile nations will invade the land of Israel because they hate the Jewish people. They hate the people of God. They hate and they want to possess God's inheritance. There's this demonic lust to possess the land, just like it has been down through history. They invade the land. They lay siege to the land of Jerusalem and Judah. They engage in taking plunder, booty, and spoil. They raid the houses. They ravish the women. The people fall by the sword. And they repeat these motifs multiple times. The people are led away as captives, as prisoners, as exiles, prisoners of war in the nations that surround them. The nations that invade them take them away as prisoners of war. But it's out of this time of darkness that their king, the Messiah, returns. And as a man of war, the divine warrior, he comes back from heaven with his armies in blazing fire, and he fights for his people and he delivers them. Again, yes, there's some complexity to the story. I want to be clear. This is one of the things that I appreciate so much about the pre-wrath perspective. It understands that there is some complexity that unfolds. Jesus came the first time in a manger. He was born, he was raised, he nursed at Mary's breasts, he went through puberty and all of the things of life. And likewise, when Jesus returns, there is a very earthy, real carrying out of the judgments of God on the earth that will take place. He comes back with a sword, not just a magic wand. And I appreciate so much the pre-wrath perspective because it understands and it recognizes the complexity of some of these things. But by the same token, don't get so caught up in your charts that you end up doing really violence and damage to the larger, simple story that the whole Bible is telling. That you end up, again, in this very Western, precise way, trying to tuck all of these passages into these neat little categories to try to make the chart fit, to the point where you end up actually confusing the story rather than simplifying it. We need to be so careful of that. So I hope that does make sense. Again, when all is said and done, there's simply no room for this king to enter Jerusalem as a friendly guy, to be marching in on a donkey, to be celebrated with good theology. The biblical testimony is consistent and it's clear. He comes as a hostile, Gentile, angry, hateful invader. And again, Jesus comes back and kills him. So that's what we're looking forward to. So thanks, guys. That's all the time that we do have for this episode. Look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, God bless and Maranatha.